All right, so I don't know if I'm gonna be able to pull this off, but it feels like it's getting pretty close to timely, and maybe I can. So let's give it a shot. Three basic ideas. The first idea has to do with something like we should consider the order of magnitude of effort or energy or degree of change that we are bringing to an event that is necessary for there to be a real change. So let me give you a concrete example. Let's say I have a very heavy sphere, like a boulder. It's maybe 100 or so pounds, and it's in a shallow pool, like some kind of concrete pool that's maybe 6 feet deep, and I want to get it out of the pool. Right now, if I push it for 4 feet and then I let go, it's going to roll back into the bottom of the pool. If I apply 80 pounds of force, it's not going to move at all. Right? So what I have to do is I have to say I have to apply more than 100 pounds of force and more than over 6 feet. And there's probably some specific physics that describe what happens as I'm going up the curve and friction and things like that. But unless I do at least that much, then it doesn't get out of the pool. Right? I get up to I move it some amount or not at all, and it will roll back to where it came from. So that's the core concept, right? The idea that if you've got some amount of change that is necessary to accomplish, I'm going to call it a real change, then you can be quite sure that if you don't impart an adequate amount, and by the way, an adequate directionality, if I have my whatever 600 foot-pounds of force and I sort of do it in a circle around the basin, around the pool, it still doesn't get out. Right? I have to have a directionality and a magnitude. I'm wasting my time. And okay, that's the first concept. That wasn't that hard. Let me say it a slightly different way to just make sure it lands. So now what I have is I have a train, and the train is on the tracks and is heading for something that's very valuable, like the classic scene of the child who's stuck on the track. And I'm a superhero, and I'm trying to stop the train. Well, it's not that hard to sort of say if the train has whatever 1 gigaton of force heading down the tracks. If I want to stop the train, I have to apply at least -1 or 1 gigaton of force going the other direction to stop the train. And if I apply 500 megatons, I slow the train down and it still kills the kid. Right? So that's it. That kind of a notion. It's simple, right? A simple idea. And yet, oftentimes, I think we find ourselves wasting our time, or at least not accomplishing our objectives, because we don't conceive of the order of magnitude of what needs to be brought, and to a lesser extent its directionality, before we go about trying to do things. Okay. 2. A little harder. This is also obviously fraught with complexity and nuance and detail. So here I have to broad brush. And the broad brush is something like, okay, what's the order of magnitude that we're dealing with? How big a challenge are we dealing with right now? If we want to affect a real change, or at least if we want to save the kid on the tracks, what do we need to accomplish? What kind of energy do we need to bring to bear? So to maybe just do a little bit of double clicking, we can take some examples. So one example might be the implications of cell phones and social media technology in the context of capitalism, right? So competition, and Metcalfe's law, right? The dynamic that the more things attract, the more valuable they get, which creates lock-in effects, and the interface between Metcalfe's law and capitalism, where lock-in effects generate huge amounts of flows of money, which generate more capacity to maintain the integrity and the existence of the thing that has lock-in. So it's being maintained through 2 dimensions. Combine that with, say, for example, sophisticated advances in cognitive science and in artificial intelligence, and the competitive landscape is attention to generate the results that my friend Tristan Harris has been continually bringing up, which is that we are becoming more and more progressively addicted. In particular, our kids are becoming more and more progressively addicted to mobile social media, Facebook, Snapchat, etc. And that when you kind of dig into the consequences at the level of neurology, at the level of like losing the capacity to even have a sense of self and self-esteem outside of these weird social signaling dynamics, the consequences are, in fact, really significantly catastrophic. So there's a train called this big complex of capitalism and technology and Metcalfe's law and cognitive science and our inability to inhibit ourselves from strip mining our cognitive psychology, and the generation of kids on a global basis that are being run over by it. All right, so that's one. Let's pick another. How about the dynamic between the hyperpolarized environment, the degree to which that hyperpolarized environment takes any particular problem. Let's say, for example, this question of whether, when, and how to wear masks, or whether, when, and how to have vaccines, and takes what is in some sense a technical problem, or at least can be addressed meaningfully as a technical problem, but converts it into a political problem, and then converts it into a hyperpolarized political problem in the context of a real event, some kind of virus pandemic, which, by the way, if you flag there's no virus, or you flag people who say there is no virus are idiots, either one of those, you're evidencing the hyperpolarization piece, and has implications where each choice that we make around this particular event generates things like giant global depressions, which generate things like giant global social unrest. Okay, that's another big problem. By the way, the trajectory of that big problem is potentially the extinction of the human race. All right, the species in general might go away as we kind of let that train move down the tracks. And we can do this over and over again. We can do it in the context of Daniel's phrase, the rivalrous game theoretics, in the context of accelerating technology is inexorably self-terminating. Right? That's a nice little pithy phrase. We can do it in the context of the implications of massive technology and rapacious competition in our environment. Fill in the blank. Long story short, big train, lots of kids, short track. What's the order of magnitude? Well, I'm increasingly of the opinion that a good metaphor, a good way of getting a sense of it, is this period of time in the West, in Europe, around the 1500s, right? The period of time where you had the 30 Years' War, a period of time where you had the emergence of science, where you had the discovery of the New World and all the implications of that from the point of view of the West, where you had the breakdown of the feudal system and the emergence of the capitalist system. Like, all these things were happening coterminously, and by the way, coalesced to self-reinforce in lots of complex ways. But that's a magnitude of change, right? That's a order of magnitude. It's substantially bigger, for example, than the civil rights movement. If you say the civil rights movement was kind of a category 1, and I don't know, the Civil War was maybe a category 3, and the Revolutionary War is a category 4, maybe this is a category 5, right? In order of magnitude. So what I would propose is that the train that we are dealing with, right, the challenge that we are faced with, is of that order of magnitude. And therefore, the solution to the problem must be of that order of magnitude or larger. And anything that is of a smaller order of magnitude is either a waste of time or could be a tactical way of buying us time, which is fine. Like, we need as much time as we can get. All right. 3. This is maybe working. How the fuck do we pull that off? So here I'm just going to propose something. This is my suggestion on how we can solve that problem. And there's something about the mode of the suggestion that is part of the suggestion itself, which is to say that if you don't understand at all what I'm about to say, that's kind of okay, because part of the point is that there's certain people who are, or at least in my proposal, in my proposition, I'm only talking to a couple of folks here, maybe several million, but not the whole population. And that group's job is to do a hell of a lot better job than I'm doing, and to bring in more. Okay, so the proposition is something like this. Big, hairy, complex problems require a a different kind of mind, a different kind of consciousness. I've referred to this variously as collective intelligence and distributed cognition. Other people talk about it differently. The guy who I've read recently, Tyson Yunkaporta, talks about it in terms of indigenous knowing. Right? Indigenous knowing intrinsically works in the context of distributed cognition. Lots of minds involved in very specific ways. The human consciousness, the human mind, developed in the context of an obligate group. We are not individuals in any meaningful sense. Right? We are always members of some group. And in fact, a pretty large group. Like that Dunbar notion of 150 people seems pretty fundamental. Right? So we fit into a context that has a large number of people. And here's the thing. We're not all the same. And we're very much not interchangeable. Like we each are well suited to some subset of the different basic roles that are obligate or necessary for the well-functioning of the human tribe. Okay, so the notion is something like this. It's a bit of a journey, but here, follow me on this. The thing we have to do is we have to actually re-tribalize. And I don't mean that in the stupid sense. I mean that in a much more nuanced sense. We tend to do something else. We like simulate tribes, and that's a mess. We have to actually find a way to actually retribalize, like really recohere with a richly connected, the word coherence is crucial, it's like the key, the point here. A richly connected group that contains all of the different subtypes of humanness that we need. So we're obligate tribal. And in that context, to become retribalized means recovering, recreating tribal-like relationships. And this means, for example, rediscovering some of the more fundamental roles in that context. And the one I'm going to bring out specifically right now, two. One is something like shaman. The other is something like, say, elder or chief or something like that. And obviously at this point the language is going to be very sketchy. We could put it slightly differently. One role has to do with the capacity and responsibility for engaging in the thing that Tyson refers to as turnaround or turnabout. Other people like Forrest Landy talk about this concept of transcendent design. And what I would say is something like the ability to perceive the transcendent operator, the generator function, the highly abstract, perceive it well, like actually be able to operate in that mode, and then to be able to support that into a capacity to be actualized. And that when I say the shamanic type, that's what I mean, that function, that capacity. And then there's another capacity, and there's, by the way, many, of course, but there's another capacity which has to do with something like representing the embodied whole. We might think of this as leadership, right? An individual who cannot help but prioritize the well-being of the whole tribe over themselves or any distinct individual, and in whom that fact has a felt reality in the other members of the tribe. So there's a sense of representing the whole in this individual. So I'll use that to describe the chief or the king or the leader or the queen, that function. Okay. So the move is something like this. The what, the how, and the who are in many ways co-creating. So at some level, there's a way to articulate a what at a level of abstraction that is too high an abstraction to be perceived by most people, and is therefore not useful at that point. However, it can be perceived by members of the shamanic class. And they can begin the process of collaborating around that level of abstraction. Here is a solution that, at least in principle, is designed to have both the order of magnitude and the directionality necessary to address the challenge that we're dealing with. And this is going to be a massive systemic shift, right? It's going to be a shift, again, of the order of magnitude of the 15th and 16th centuries. Then that who begins to have enough completeness and enough clarity and perhaps qualitative expression to begin bringing in this next category of who, right? These chieftains, these queens, who have hopefully an ability to also perceive that, probably in a more embodied way, but in whom is vested the responsibility and the capacity to generate coherence among the people, right? Among the body of the whole of the tribe, the rest of the people. And then there's a collaboration, right, between the shamanic type and the chieftain type, in increasingly more richly articulating the what, and then increasingly more fully embodying the what into hows. Right? The chieftain category is going to have a vastly superior capacity both to articulate and to execute on the how. Then we start bringing in other types. Right? There are key elements to this, other typologies that have capacities to do things like implementation and strategy, and maintaining integrity and conflict resolution, and all the other stuff that's part of humaning. And so there's a recovery of a fundamental topology of the human tribe that has the capacity to contemplate the order of magnitude of complexity and intensity and directionality necessary to address the fundamental problem, which has a progressive process where the more the who is real, the more the what becomes real, which increases the capacity to attract and orient a more real who, and you start getting a positive feedback loop until the how starts showing up, and then it's done. Okay? Now, I warned you. That's pretty darn abstract. I myself can prefer, I can generate instantiations of the abstraction in the practical, but they're not right. They're not good enough. They're not rich enough. They're useful as examples to orient people and help them begin to sort of in themselves, oh, right, okay, that kind of thing, I get what you're talking about, maybe more like this. So the thing, of course, is we need more who. And we need to do it pretty quickly, which is the point of this series.